August 17, 1984. The town of Millbrook, New York, was suffocating under a heat wave. 97 degrees. Humidity so thick you could feel it pressing down on your chest. Lawn sprinklers spun in lazy circles. Children sat on porch steps with popsicles melting down their fingers. Too hot to run. Too hot to play. The air was heavy. Still, the kind of stillness that comes right before a storm breaks. On Maple Drive, a man named Sergeant Richard Vance stood in his driveway, staring at a dent in his mailbox. He was 42 years old. His uniform was starched and pressed, despite the heat. His patrol car, a white and blue Plymouth Grand Fury, idled in the driveway behind him, the air conditioner struggling against the August humidity. He had been a cop for 16 years. Served in Vietnam before that. Bronze Star. 2 Purple Hearts. He was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a room. His wife, Eleanor, watched him from the kitchen window. She was wiping the same coffee mug over and over. She always did that when she was anxious. She wanted to call out to him, to tell him it was just a dent, kids on bikes, let it go, but she didn't. She knew better. Richard didn't let things go. It wasn't in his DNA. He ran his thumb over the cold metal of the dent, frowning. Then he looked up and down the street. Maple Drive was a good neighborhood, respectable. Neighbors waved, but they kept their distance. Everybody knew Sergeant Vance. Everybody respected Sergeant Vance. But nobody knew what he was thinking. Nobody ever did. He got in the car. He adjusted the rear-view mirror, glancing at the back seat. Empty. It was always empty now. His daughter, Emily, was 15. She was at the mall with her friends. She barely spoke to him anymore. Teenagers. He understood. He'd been distant, too. The job does that. It builds a wall between you and the people you love. Brick by brick, case by case. He backed out of the driveway. He didn't wave goodbye to Eleanor. He never did. He just raised 2 fingers from the steering wheel. A small salute. A habit from the war. His first call of the shift was routine. A noise complaint at the old Henderson lumberyard on the edge of town. Kids drinking beer, maybe smoking pot. Nothing a cop with a flashlight couldn't handle. He radioed dispatch at 7:12 p.m. Car 7 to dispatch. Arriving on scene at Henderson Lumber. Quiet so far. Go and take a look around. Copy, Car 7. Watch your 6. Watch your 6. Look behind you. Standard radio chatter. Nobody thought twice about it. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, skeletal shadows through the stacks of untreated timber. The lumberyard had been closed for 3 years. Bankrupt. It smelled of rot and creosote and standing water. Richard got out of the car. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't need to. He walked toward the main shed. The gravel crunched under his polished black boots. And then the transmission cut out. At 8:45 p.m., dispatch tried to raise him. Car 7, what's your status? Silence. Car 7, dispatch requesting status update. Silence. The shift supervisor sent a unit to check on him. Officer Dan Riley, a rookie, pulled into the lumberyard at 9:12. He saw the Plymouth Grand Fury parked at an odd angle, the driver's door wide open. The dome light was on, draining the battery. The engine ticked as it cooled. Riley got out. His flashlight beam cut through the dust and the darkness. The car was empty. Sergeant Vance was gone. His hat was on the front seat. His clipboard was on the dash. His coffee cup, still half full, was resting perfectly upright in the cup holder. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood. No skid marks. No footprints leading away that weren't Vance's own. It looked like he had simply vanished into thin air. At first, they thought he was hurt. Maybe he chased someone into the woods and got lost. They brought out dogs, bloodhounds. They tracked his scent from the car door to a pile of rotting pallets. And there the scent stopped completely, as if he'd been lifted up and carried away by the wind. The search lasted 3 weeks. They dragged the Hudson River. They drained Old Miller's Pond. They interviewed every teenager, every drifter, every ex-convict within 100 miles. Nothing. Sergeant Richard Vance, a decorated war veteran, a husband, a father, was gone. Eleanor waited by the phone every night for a year. Emily stopped going to school. The town of Millbrook whispered, but the whispers faded. 15 years passed. And then, in the autumn of 1999, a backhoe operator digging a foundation for a new housing development felt his machine jerk against something that was not rock. To understand the horror of what was discovered in 1999, you have to understand the men who were looking for it. By 1999, the Millbrook Police Department was a shadow of its 1984 self. Budget cuts, low morale, the old guard, the men who had walked the beat with Richard Vance, were mostly gone, retired, sick, dead. But one man remained, Chief William Callahan. Chief Callahan was 68 years old. He was supposed to have retired 5 years ago, but he couldn't leave. He spent his days sitting in a cramped, dusty office, surrounded by filing cabinets stuffed with cold cases. The Vance file was the thickest. It sat on the corner of his desk, always within arm's reach. He didn't look at the file anymore. He didn't need to. He had memorized every detail. The dent in the mailbox, the untouched coffee, the scent stopping at the pallets. Callahan had been Richard's partner. They had served together in Vietnam. 2 scared kids from upstate New York who promised each other they'd make a home. They made it home, but only one of them got to live. Callahan had been home with the flu on August 17, 1984, drinking soup, watching television. While his partner was out there, alone, he carried that guilt every day for 15 years. On the morning of October 14, 1999, Callahan was staring at the rain running down his office window when his phone rang. It was a county sheriff's office, a construction crew over on Old Mill Road. They'd found something. Callahan didn't ask what. He just grabbed his coat. The drive took 20 minutes. The rain had turned the freshly graded dirt roads into rivers of mud. Callahan's sedan slipped and slid as he approached the site. He saw the yellow tape first, then the coroner's van, then the backhoe, sitting silent and cold, its bucket resting on the ground like a sleeping animal. A young deputy tried to stop him. "Sir, this is an active scene." "Son, I've been active on this scene since before you learned to walk." "Move." He ducked under the tape. The excavation site was a raw gash in the earth, 20 feet wide, 15 feet deep. The walls of the pit were sheer and damp, glistening like wet clay. At the bottom, lying in a tangle of roots and dark soil, was a car. It was a 1978 Ford LTD, 4-door, beige. The paint was blistered and peeling. The chrome bumpers were pitted with rust. The tires were flat, swallowed by the mud. Callahan felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't Richard's car. Richard drove a Plymouth. This was a civilian vehicle, a family car. He walked down the ramp into the pit. His shoes squelched in the mud. He peered through the driver's side window, wiping the grime away with his sleeve. The interior was black with mold. The seats were shredded by rodents, but the dashboard was intact. And there, hanging from the rearview mirror, was a single object, a Millbrook Police Department badge. Not Richard's badge. An older style, one they hadn't used since the 1970s. Callahan didn't recognize the car. He didn't recognize the badge. But the VIN number, when they ran it, told a story that made his blood run cold. The car was registered to a man named Harold Finch. Harold Finch had been a sergeant on the Millbrook PD. He had retired in 1978. He had moved to Florida. And in 1981, 3 years before Richard Vance disappeared, Harold Finch had been reported missing by his wife. He had walked out his front door to get the newspaper and never came back. They never found him. They never found the car. Until now, Callahan stood in the rain, staring at the empty driver's seat, the seat where Harold Finch should have been. He wasn't there. He opened the trunk. Inside the trunk, curled into a fetal position, wrapped in a plastic tarp and bound with electrical wire, was the skeletal remains of Harold Finch. He had been shot twice, once in the back of the head, once in the chest. The initial investigation suggested this was a robbery, a retired cop killed for his wallet. But if it was a robbery, why was the car buried? Why was it hidden so deep that it took 18 years to find? And then the forensics team found something else. Something that didn't belong to Harold Finch. Lodged in the trunk's rusted hinge mechanism was a single, intact fingerprint. It was too fresh to be Finch's. It was left there years after the body was placed. Whoever buried this car had opened the trunk, looked at the dead man inside, and closed it again. They ran the print. The computer screen blinked. No, that's not possible. The print belonged to Richard Vance. In the days that followed, Millbrook became a circus. News vans clogged the streets. Reporters camped out on the lawn of the police station. The headline was too perfect, too cinematic. Cop vanishes, linked to cop's murder. Chief Callahan locked himself in his office. He didn't sleep. He barely ate. He just stared at the wall, replaying every conversation he'd ever had with Richard. He kept coming back to one memory. 1979. The department Christmas party. Richard was standing by the punch bowl, holding his drink but not drinking it. He was staring across the room at Harold Finch. Finch was laughing, telling war stories, holding court with the younger officers. Callahan had walked up to Richard, clapped him on the shoulder. "You all right, Dickie? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine, just tired." But he wasn't fine. His jaw was clenched. His knuckles were white around the glass. Callahan had dismissed it. Richard had always been intense. He held grudges. He didn't forgive easily. It was what made him a good cop, but a difficult friend. Now, 20 years later, Callahan realized he hadn't been looking at a man holding a grudge. He had been looking at a man taking mental notes. The investigation into Richard Vance shifted from missing person to suspect. They got a warrant. They went to Eleanor's house, the same house on Maple Drive, now faded and tired, the mailbox still dented. Eleanor was 70 years old. She moved slowly, her joints swollen with arthritis. She looked at the warrant, then at Callahan. "You used to eat dinner at this table. Bill, you used to hold Emily on your knee. And now you come here with a piece of paper telling me my husband was a murderer. Eleanor, I need to know the truth." "The truth? The truth is you left him out there. You were supposed to have his back, and you were home in bed." She let them in. They searched the attic, the basement, the garage. They found old photo albums, Vietnam medals, fishing rods. They found a box of Eleanor's love letters, tied with ribbon. They found Emily's baby shoes. And in the back of Richard's closet, hidden beneath a stack of sweaters, they found a locked metal strongbox. It took a locksmith 3 hours to open it. Inside, there was no cash, no jewels, no confession, just a notebook. It was a cheap spiral-bound notebook, the kind you buy at a drugstore for 99 cents. The cover was faded. The spiral was bent. The pages were yellowed and brittle. Callahan opened it. The handwriting was Richard's. Neat, precise, military. And it was a list. Dozens of names, dates, locations. Next to each name, there was a symbol, a small, dark check mark, or a question mark. Callahan recognized some of the names. Local businessmen, politicians, a judge, and other names, fellow officers, retired officers. Harold Finch was on the list. Next to Harold Finch's name, there was a check mark and a single handwritten word. Done. Who was Richard Vance? For 16 years, the town of Millbrook thought they knew. He was a hero, the protector, the man who walked into danger, so others didn't have to. But the notebook painted a very different picture. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger, a chronicle of surveillance. Richard had been watching his colleagues, his neighbors, his superiors. He had documented their habits, their debts, their secrets. Callahan recognized the methodology. It was textbook police work, stakeouts, pattern analysis, evidence gathering. Richard wasn't keeping journal. He was building cases against his own department. The first name on the list that Callahan recognized, beyond Harold Finch, was a man named Thomas Greer. Tommy Greer. He had been a beat cop in the 70s. Not a star, but solid, reliable. He retired in 1985, a year after Richard vanished. Moved out west. Oregon, maybe. He had died in 1992. Heart attack. Richard's notes on Greer were extensive. He had documented Greer's gambling habits, his debts to loan sharks, a suspicious inheritance that didn't match his salary. And then, buried in the middle of the notes, a bombshell. Greer had been a responding officer to a burglary call in 1974. A jewelry store on Main Street. The owner was beaten, left in coma. The thieves got away with $50,000 in diamonds. The case was never solved. Richard believed Greer wasn't just a responding officer. He believed Greer was the inside man. Callahan slammed the notebook shut. His hands were shaking. If Richard was right, if the Millbrook PD was harboring corrupt cops, dirty money, and unsolved crimes, then Richard wasn't just a missing person. He was a whistleblower. And whistleblowers don't usually disappear by accident. Give me everything on Thomas Greer. His pension records, his phone bills, his dental appointments. I want to know who he talked to, who he was afraid of, and who he called the week Richard Vance went missing. It took 3 days. On the third day, a researcher from the state archives found something, a phone record. October 12, 1984, 2 months after Richard vanished. A collect call from a payphone in Millbrook to a number in Coos Bay, Oregon. The number belonged to Thomas Greer. The call lasted 47 seconds. The payphone was located at a gas station exactly 1.2 miles from the Henderson lumberyard. Someone, 2 months after Richard disappeared, called Tommy Greer in Oregon. Someone who knew where the payphone was. Someone who knew Greer's number by heart. Or someone who was using Greer to cover their tracks. Callahan stared at the record. 47 seconds wasn't a chat. It was a confirmation. A coded message. It's done. Stay quiet. He's gone. But Greer was dead. He took his secrets to the grave. Or so they thought. Because while Callahan was digging through phone records, a letter arrived at the police station. It was addressed in shaky, elderly handwriting to the chief of police. It was postmarked Coos Bay, Oregon. The return address? The estate of Thomas Greer, deceased. Inside the envelope was a single photograph. It was taken in 1984. The date stamp was blurred, but the lab confirmed it, August 18th, the morning after Richard vanished. The photograph showed a man standing next to a white and blue Plymouth Grand Fury. The door was open. The man was reaching inside, placing something on the front seat. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadow of a tree branch, but his uniform was visible, Millbrook PD, and his hand, resting on the doorframe, bore a distinctive scar across the knuckles. Callahan felt the floor drop out from under him. He knew that scar. He had bandaged that scar in a foxhole in 1969. It was Richard Vance. Richard was putting his own hat on the seat, arranging his own coffee cup, staging his own disappearance. And standing next to him, holding the camera, was Thomas Greer. Richard Vance didn't vanish. He walked away, and Tommy Greer helped him. The narrative had shifted. Richard Vance was no longer a victim. He was a fugitive, a killer, a man who had orchestrated his own death so thoroughly that even his own wife believed he was dead. But why? Why destroy your life, abandon your family, and bury a body in a car, only to leave a trail of evidence that would take 15 years to unravel? Callahan went back to the notebook. He stopped looking for names. He started looking for patterns. Richard had organized the list chronologically. The earliest entries were from 1973. Small things. A cop taking free coffee from a diner. Another cop accepting a discount on a used car. Minor corruption. Pettiness. But the entries grew darker. 1975. A robbery suspect who died in custody. Ruled accidental. Richard had written in the margin, witness places Greer in interrogation room alone with suspect. No one else. Injuries inconsistent with official report. A drug bust gone wrong. Evidence went missing from the lockup. $20,000 in cash and 2 kilos of cocaine. Never recovered. Harold Finch retired. Richard wrote, Finch knows. He was there. He took the money. He thinks it's over. It's not over. And then 1980. A single name, underlined 3 times. The broker. No real name. No address. No physical description. Just notes. The broker operates outside the department. No record. No file. Contact only through intermediaries. Pays in cash. Requests specific services. Theft. Arson. Elimination of witnesses. Greer's a link. Greer takes orders from the broker. Greer pays the men who do the work. Finch was the accountant. He kept the books. He knew where the bodies were buried. Callahan read the last line and felt the hair on his arm stand up. Finch is dead. I made sure of it, but the broker is still out there. He knows what I know. He knows I'm coming for him. I just need to find him first. Richard wasn't a killer, not in the way they thought. He was a cleaner. He wasn't murdering innocent people. He was executing a covert operation to eliminate the rot inside his own department. Harold Finch wasn't a random victim. He was a target, the accountant, the man who kept the ledgers of corruption. Richard killed him, buried him in his own car, and waited. He waited to see who would come looking. Nobody did. The department didn't investigate Harold Finch's disappearance. They rubber-stamped it. Missing, presumed voluntary. They closed the file and moved on. That was the moment Richard Vance realized the truth. It wasn't just a few bad apples. The entire barrel was poisoned. Emily Vance, Richard's daughter, was 41 years old when the photograph surfaced. She lived in Vermont. She had changed her name. She hadn't spoken to a reporter in 15 years. But Callahan needed to talk to her. He drove up to Burlington on a cold November morning. He found her at a small bookstore on Church Street, where she worked as a manager. She looked like her mother. Same tired eyes. Same way of holding herself, like she was bracing for bad news. She didn't invite him inside. They stood on the sidewalk, breath fogging in the cold. I knew. Excuse me? That night, August 17th, 1984. I wasn't at the mall. I lied. I told my mother I was at the mall, but I wasn't. I was at the lumberyard. Callahan felt his heart stop. I was 15. I was angry. I wanted to tell him I hated him. I wanted to tell him I never wanted to see him again. Stupid teenage stuff. I took my bike. I hid behind the stacks of wood. I saw him get out of the car. I saw another car pull up, an old Ford. I saw my father. I saw him shoot a man in the back of the head. Emily, he didn't know I was there. I saw him put the body in the trunk. I saw him drive car away. I went home. I got in bed. I never told anyone. Not my mother. Not the police. Not you. I let you all think he was a hero. I let you waste 15 years looking for a victim who never existed. My father wasn't a victim, Chief. He was a soldier, and he finished his war. She turned and walked back into the bookstore. The bell above the door chimed softly. Callahan stood alone on the sidewalk, the photograph of Richard placing his hat on the seat burning a hole in his coat pocket. He finally knew what happened that night, but he still didn't know where Richard Vance went, or if he was even still alive. The search for Richard Vance entered its most intense phase. They had his DNA now, dental records, fingerprints. They had a photograph of him from 1984. But people change in 15 years. Hair grays, faces soften, eyes lose their fire. They put out a bolo to every law enforcement agency in the country. They sent his photo to the FBI, the Marshal Service, the RCMP. Nothing. It was as if Richard Vance had walked off the face of the earth. But Callahan knew better. Richard wasn't hiding. He was hunting. 2 weeks after the interview with Emily, Callahan received a call from a state trooper in northern Montana, a remote town called Havre, population 9,000, hard against the Canadian border. An elderly man had been found dead in his home. Natural causes, apparently. Heart attack. But when the troopers searched the house, they found something unusual. A wall, covered in photographs, maps, and documents, connected by red string, like a detective's conspiracy board in a movie. The dead man's name was Walter Keene. He had been a sergeant on the Millbrook PD from 1968 to 1975. He had retired early, moved west, lived alone, and on his wall, in the center of the web, was a photograph of Richard Vance. Callahan flew to Montana. The house was small. A single-story ranch, faded yellow siding, a roof sagging under decades of snow. Inside, it smelled of stale coffee and old paper. The trooper met him at the door. "We haven't touched anything. I've never seen anything like it." Callahan walked into the living room. The wall was floor to ceiling. Hundreds of photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes. He saw Harold Finch, Thomas Greer, a dozen other faces he recognized from Richard's notebook. And he saw Richard, not just one photograph. Dozens. Richard at his patrol car, Richard at a diner, Richard walking into his house on Maple Drive, dates written in the margins in neat, precise handwriting. August 16th, 1984. Vance leaves residence 0700 hours. August 17th, 1984. Vance called to Henderson lumberyard 1912 hours. No follow-up. No report filed. August 18th, 1984. Vance vehicle located. Vance missing. Search initiated. Walter Keene hadn't been hiding from Richard. He had been tracking him. And the final photograph on the wall, dated October 1999, just 2 weeks before Keene died, showed a man standing at a bus stop in downtown Havre. The man was older, white hair, thick glasses. He wore a flannel jacket and carried a canvas shopping bag, but his posture was unmistakable. Straight-backed, military. It was Richard Vance. He had been living in the same town as his stalker for years, and he had no idea. Callahan searched the house for a clue, anything that would tell him where Richard was now. He found it in the bedroom. A safe, hidden behind a painting of a mountain landscape. Inside the safe, a single object, a cassette tape, hand-labeled in black marker, Vance. Do not destroy. Callahan borrowed a tape player from the trooper's cruiser. He sat at Walter Keene's kitchen table, surrounded by the ghosts of the 30-year conspiracy, and pressed play. The tape hissed. Then a voice, elderly, weary. "My name is Walter Keene, former sergeant, Millbrook PD, badge number 4417. If you're listening to this, I'm dead, and you need to know the truth." Keene spoke for 40 minutes. He confessed to everything. The stolen money, the fixed cases, the beatings in the interrogation room. He named names, judges who took bribes, lawyers who buried evidence, cops who killed and called it self-defense. And he named the broker. The broker wasn't one man. It was a position, a role. When one broker retired, another took his place. I was the broker. From 1972 to 1975, I took over from Harold Finch. I passed it to Thomas Greer. I don't know who took over after Greer. Maybe nobody. Maybe the whole thing collapsed. But Richard Vance, he was never supposed to be part of it. He was clean, too clean. He didn't fit. He was a problem. We tried to bring him in. He refused. We tried to push him out. He fought back. And when he killed Harold Finch, we knew he wasn't going to stop. He was going to tear us all down. Keene paused. The tape crackled. I ran. I ran all the way to Montana. I spent 20 years looking over my shoulder. And then one day, I saw him at the grocery store, buying bread. He was old. He was tired. He wasn't hunting me. He was just living. And I realized he wasn't the monster. We were. We made him. We pushed him. And he survived. We're all dead or dying now. But he's still here. Richard Vance won. I just wanted someone to know that. The tape ended. Callahan sat in the silence. Richard Vance wasn't a fugitive. He was a survivor. The confession of Walter Keene blew the case wide open. The state attorney general launched a full-scale investigation into the Millbrook PD. The old records were unsealed. Witnesses who had been silent for decades suddenly found their voices. 3 former officers were arrested for perjury and obstruction. A retired judge surrendered his license to avoid prosecution. The families of 4 unsolved homicide victims from the 1970s received long overdue apologies. But Richard Vance remained invisible. Callahan knew he was close. Havre, Montana, was a small town. Someone had to know the old man with the military posture who bought bread at the grocery store. He put out a local call, asked for tips. A woman named Margaret Owens came forward. She was 75 years old, a widow. She lived on the outskirts of Havre, in a farmhouse that had been in her family for 3 generations. She told the troopers that a man named Richard had been her handyman for the past 12 years. He fixed her fence, patched her roof, shoveled her snow. He was quiet, polite. He didn't talk about his past. He told me his wife died. I didn't ask for details. It wasn't my place. He was a good man. He deserved some peace. Where is he now, Margaret? He left 3 days ago. Said he had to go home. Said there was something he needed to finish. Callahan felt the blood drain from his face. Home, Millbrook. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles left Havre at dawn. Callahan drove straight through, swapping drivers, running on coffee and adrenaline. They hit the Millbrook town line at 11:47 p.m. on a frigid December night. The streets were empty. Christmas lights twinkled in windows. Wreaths hung on doors. And there, sitting on a bench in the town square, directly beneath the war memorial, was an old man. He was wrapped in a heavy wool coat. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, rested on the handle of a wooden cane. His face was weathered, deeply lined, but his eyes, those eyes were the same. Cold, steady, unafraid. Callahan got out of the car. His boots crunched on the frozen grass. "Dickie?" Richard Vance looked up. He didn't smile. He didn't flinch. "Bill, you look old. You look like hell." "Feel like it, too." There was a long silence. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches of the oak trees. "I knew you'd find me eventually. I just want to see it one more time. The old town, the old square, before the end. Richard, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Finch, for fleeing to avoid prosecution, for... I know what I did, Bill. I've had 15 years to think about it. 15 years to wonder if I made the right choice." He paused. His gaze drifted to the memorial. "I served this country. I served this town. I took an oath to protect the innocent and uphold the law. And then I watched the men I served would break that oath over and over until the law was just a word, a joke. Harold Finch wasn't a victim. He was a predator. He took money from drug dealers. He buried evidence that would have freed innocent men. He ruined lives. And nobody stopped him. Nobody except me. You could have gone to the state police, the FBI. I tried. I went to the chief in 1978. He told me to drop it. He told me I was damaging morale. He told me to be a team player. The system was broken, Bill. The system was the enemy. The only way to fix it was to cut out the cancer, one piece at a time. Callahan didn't have a response. He thought about Eleanor, waiting by the phone for a call that never came. He thought about Emily, carrying the weight of her father's secret for 40 years. He thought about Harold Finch, rotting in the trunk of his own car. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were the only good thing left. You were the only cop I still trusted. If I told you, I would have made you an accomplice. I would have dragged you into the mud with me. I couldn't do that. You had a family. You had a life. I already threw mine away." He stood up, slowly, painfully. "I'm tired, Bill. I'm so tired. Let's go." Callahan pulled out his handcuffs. Old school, nickel-plated. The same model they'd carried on patrol 40 years ago. He reached for Richard's wrists, and then he stopped. He looked at the cuffs. He looked at Richard's face. He looked at the memorial, etched with the names of the dead. "Turn around, Dickie. Walk away. Go back to Montana. Disappear again. I'll tell him I was too late. I'll tell him you got away." Richard shook his head. No, Bill, I'm done running. I've been running since 1984. I ran from my wife. I ran from my daughter. I ran from the truth. I can't run anymore. He held out his wrists. To your job, Chief. The cuffs clicked shut. The sound echoed across the empty square. The interrogation lasted 14 hours. Richard didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask for food or water. He just sat in a hard plastic chair, hands cuffed to the table, and talked. He talked about Vietnam, the things he saw, the things he did, the way the war taught him that survival sometimes requires sacrifice. He talked about coming home, the parades, the thanks, the hollow feeling that none of it mattered, because the war was over but the fight wasn't. He talked about Harold Finch. I didn't plan to kill him, not at first. I just wanted to confront him. I wanted him to look me in the eye and admit what he'd done. But when I saw him sitting in his living room, watching TV like nothing was wrong, I just snapped. I pulled my service weapon. I told him to get in the car. He begged. He cried. He offered me money. He offered me anything. I told him the only thing I wanted was the truth. He gave me names, dates, account numbers. And when he was done talking, I shot him. Why the trunk? Because that's where he belonged, with the garbage, with the things nobody wants to look at. He talked about the notebook, the years of surveillance, the slow, methodical hunt for every corrupt cop, every compromised official, every man who had traded his badge for cash. He talked about his daughter. I saw her that night, at the lumberyard. I saw her hiding behind the pallets. I knew she was there. I knew she saw everything. I wanted to go to her. I wanted to explain. But what do you say? Daddy just killed a man, but it's okay because he was a bad man. She was 15 years old. I couldn't do that to her. So I got in the car and I drove away. I drove away from my daughter and I never looked back. His voice broke. Just once. I thought I was protecting her. I thought keeping my distance was the right thing to do. But I was just a coward. I was too afraid to face what I'd done. He talked about the years in Montana, the loneliness, the silence, the mornings he woke up reaching for Eleanor, only to find empty space beside him. He talked about Walter Keene. I knew he was there. I saw him watching me. I could have killed him, too. I thought about it. But I was tired of killing. I was tired of the blood. I just wanted to live out my days in peace. Let the past be the past. But the past doesn't let go. Bill, it waits. It follows you. And eventually it catches up. At 5 a.m., Callahan slid a piece of paper across the table. Sign this. It's a full confession. It covers the Finch homicide, the flight, everything. It won't save you, but it'll give the family some closure. Richard picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly. He signed his name. Richard Thomas Vance. August 17th, 1942, blank. What happens now? Now you go before a judge. You get a lawyer. You plead your case. And Eleanor? Emily? I don't know, Dickie. I don't know if they'll want to see you. Richard nodded slowly. Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I never stopped loving them. Tell them I wish I'd been braver. Callahan stood up. He walked to the door. He paused. I'll tell them. The door clicked shut. The trial of Richard Vance was the longest in Millbrook County history. The prosecution painted him as a vigilante, a cold-blooded killer who took the law into his own hands. They brought out photographs of Harold Finch's skeleton, curled in the trunk, the bullet holes in his skull. They played the tape of Walter Keene, calling Richard a problem that needed to be solved. The defense painted a different picture. They called witnesses, victims of the corruption, families who had waited decades for justice. A man named Samuel Wright, who had spent 8 years in prison for a robbery he didn't commit, a robbery the police knew was committed by a man connected to Thomas Greer. Samuel Wright was 63 years old. He walked to the witness stand with a cane. He looked at Richard Vance, sitting at the defense table in his prison blues, and he began to cry. I prayed for this man every night for 30 years. I didn't know his name. I didn't know his face. But I knew someone out there was fighting for me. Someone believed I was innocent. That man saved my life. Not the day he killed somebody, the day he decided to tell the truth. The jury deliberated for 6 days. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of voluntary manslaughter, not murder, manslaughter. The judge, a stern woman with sad eyes, looked down at Richard. "Sergeant Vance, you have admitted to taking a life. That is a grave sin, regardless of the circumstances. But you have also spent 15 years paying a penance that no court could ever impose. You lost your family. You lost your identity. You lost everything you ever loved. I cannot give you back those years. I cannot erase the pain you have caused. What I can do is acknowledge that you acted not out of malice, but out of a desperate belief that justice had failed. I sentence you to 10 years in state prison. 10 years. For a man who was already 72 years old, it was a life sentence." Richard showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if he had expected this outcome all along. As the marshals led him away, he turned his head. Eleanor was sitting in the front row. She was 78 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands were curled with arthritis. She wore the same pearl necklace she had worn on their wedding day. Their eyes met. Richard mouthed 3 words. "I'm sorry." Eleanor did not respond, but she didn't look away. Richard Vance died on June 3rd, 2003. He was 74 years old. The official cause was heart failure, but the men who guarded him said he simply stopped fighting. He woke up one morning, looked out the window at the gray prison sky, and decided he had carried the weight long enough. He was buried in the Millbrook Cemetery in a plot he had purchased in 1978. He had planned his own ending long before he ever pulled the trigger. Eleanor came to the funeral. She stood alone at the grave, leaning on her daughter's arm. The wind tugged at her black veil. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She just placed her hand on the cold headstone and left it there. "You stubborn, stupid man. You always thought you had to carry the world by yourself. You never learned to ask for help." She bent down and placed something on the grass. A single photograph. Richard, in his dress uniform, holding a baby girl in his arms. Smiling, really smiling. The date on the back read, Emily, 1969. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect. Emily Vance. She had taken back her maiden name, stood beside her mother. She was 43 years old. She had her father's eyes. Cold, steady. She didn't speak at the funeral. But that night, she drove to the Henderson lumberyard. It was gone now, bulldozed, replaced by a strip mall and a parking lot. The ghosts had been paved over. She stood in the empty parking lot, staring at the place where her childhood had ended. She thought about her father, the man who killed, the man who ran, the man who spent 15 years alone in a cold house in Montana, waiting to die. She thought about the photograph of him holding her, the joy in his eyes. She thought about the last time she saw him alive, the handcuffs, the gray prison uniform, the words he mouthed across the courtroom. "I'm sorry." She had waited 40 years to hear those words. She wasn't sure if they were enough, but standing there in the dark, in the cold, she realized something. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man, a flawed, broken man who made an impossible choice and spent the rest of his life paying for it. "I forgive you, Dad." The wind carried her whisper away into the night. Chief William Callahan retired 6 months after the trial. He moved to Florida, where he spent his mornings fishing and his afternoons avoiding the news. He died in 2010, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. On his nightstand, next to his reading glasses, was a photograph of 2 young men in military fatigues, grinning at the camera, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Vietnam, 1968. Before the war, before the badge, before the blood. Just 2 friends who thought they were invincible. The Millbrook Police Department was restructured. The old guard retired or resigned. New officers, young and idealistic, took their places. The corruption was exposed. The guilty were punished. The innocent were exonerated, but the scars remained. The dent in the mailbox at 42 Maple Drive was never fixed. Eleanor refused to let anyone touch it. She said it was the last thing her husband touched before he left. She said it made her feel like he might come home. Eleanor Vance died in 2015 at the age of 92. She was buried next to Richard, beneath a single headstone engraved with both their names. On the back of the headstone, at Eleanor's request, was a line from a poem Richard had loved in college. Though much is taken, much abides. The notebook, the tape, the photograph, they are stored now in the county archives, in a climate control room, accessible only to researchers with special clearance. The case is closed, but the questions remain. How many Harold Finches are still out there, buried in unmarked graves, their secrets rotting alongside their bones? How many Richard Vances are living in the shadows, carrying sins they can never confess? How many towns like Millbrook have facades of peace hiding decades of rot? There is no easy answer. There is no moral to this story. There is only the silence of cemetery, the rustle of autumn leaves, the fading echo of a name carved in stone. Richard Thomas Vance, Sergeant, Soldier, Father, 1942 to 2003. Beloved, forgiven, remembered. Sergeant Vance vanished in 1984. 15 years later, what they found was too horrific to explain. But perhaps, in the end, the horror wasn't what he did. It was why he felt he had to do it alone. The backhoe operator who found Harold Finch's car retired in 2001. He moved to a small town in Vermont. He never spoke about what he saw that day, but sometimes late at night, he would wake up sweating. The image of that rusted trunk burned into his memory. He said it wasn't the skeleton that haunted him. It was the badge, hanging from the rearview mirror, spinning slowly in the dark. He said it looked like it was waiting for someone to come and claim it. Nobody ever did.